So we're here today, and we're going to have a conversation with Janice Fleming because a couple of reasons why. But recently, Janice Fleming has been the talk of the town, I think we can say, or has come up in conversations around the city of Hartford. And I think it's time that the city of Hartford got to know Janice Fleming for once, instead of hearing about her in a third-hand conversation. And today's conversation is going to put some of that to rest and bring some things to light about things happening here in the city of Hartford. So welcome, Janice Fleming.
Thank you, Naisha, for having me. A little nervous.
Okay.
Right? You know, organizers, I find myself in front of the camera more nowadays, and so but I thank you for having me, and I'm willing to answer any tough questions you may have.
Okay. Now let's get right into your background, and I'm going to go back to your childhood because you grew up here in Hartford.
Yes, yes.
You grew up in Charter Oak.
Well, no. First, I grew up. The first part of my childhood was spent on Barber Street in the townhouses. Actually, my mother, and at that time I had only two sisters. Okay. And so it was just the three of us and my mom and my brother. We all lived on in Barber Street in the townhouses. And so I went to Freddie Wish School, and my grandparents lived in Chappelle all their lives. My aunt still live in Chappelle. My cousins live on Cleveland Avenue. Those are the Harrises.
Okay.
And I first originally, the beginning of my childhood was, I lived in North Hartford. Now, when I turned about 12, we moved on Hamilton Street. And at that time, it was a predominantly Portuguese community. And so that was fun. Right. We had all kind of Portuguese pastries and everything. And so I went to Mary Hooker School and graduated from there and went to Burr School as a middle school. And then for high school, I went to AI Prince Tech. So from that point on, from junior high on, I lived in Charter Oak Terrace on A side.
Okay. Which is now the wonderful Walmart. Plaza.
This is true.
Talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah.
Okay. So, as a profession, you have traveled the road of an organizer.
Yes.
Were those seeds planted from growing up in
the
different various communities in Hartford?
Actually, no. After I lost both of my parents in this city and raised all my siblings, so it's 6 of us. I have 4 sisters and 1 brother. And at the time when my mother was ill, my dad hadn't died yet. And we were trying to figure out what exactly would be our plans. We don't have any parents. But I was 15 and already preparing to graduate from high school. And my sister had already graduated. She was 18. And I didn't know what to do, and so I worked a job at Avon Payne and the Boys and Girls Club because I played basketball. I was really good at that, and went to Capital Community College, but that took a long time to finish because I was raising kids. Probably about right when it was time for me to graduate in '99, I met a woman named Laura Lockwood, who was a professor at Trinity. She's a director at the Women's Center in Trinity College, but she was a professor at what is now Capital Community College, but it was called Greater Hartford.
That's right.
Community College back then.
Yeah.
And I had taken this leadership, I can't remember if it was an organizing leadership class, and she was teaching, and I found it to be very interesting. We talked about social movements and, all of these different issues around community, and I found myself challenging her on some of the things that she felt and getting really passionate about it. And one day she invited in Alta Lash and Lou Santana to the class. And it was then that Alta had asked me would I be interested in organizing. I had no idea what it was. I'm like, I didn't graduate, like spend all this time doing this, like, and graduate to organize, like what?
Right.
And so she said, no, communities and people. And I couldn't like wrap my head around that concept of like organizing communities and people. What does that look like? So I became intrigued. And so Lorenzo Jones at the time was at UCAN, and I went over to meet with Lorenzo Jones and Alta Lash, and that's how my career started.
Okay. And so how many years has that been?
Oh my God. Since 99.
Okay.
So where are we?
2009, so yeah, 10 years.
10 years. Yeah. Feels a lot longer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what types of issues does a community organizer deal with? What do you do?
Well, it's not up to the community organizer to come up with the issue.
Okay.
It's the community's job to come up with the issue, and it's the organizer job to help the community articulate whatever message that they're trying to send.
Okay.
So, you know, this idea of, you know, organizers having the power to pick which issues is just not true.
Okay, so a community organizer, it's not your agenda?
No, it's not my agenda.
Okay.
We're fortunate enough to actually get paid to do what so many people do, and they don't get paid. I have a lot of wonderful women who I've worked with over the years. Actually, one of the first women who ever taught me how to organize effectively was Hyacinth Yenny, and she's never received $1 for her leadership abilities, and she's still very active. And so a lot of my ability to reach people on the ground I must attribute to some of Hyacinth's teaching.
Did you meet Hyacinth when you were at Hart?
Oh yeah, I don't know if a lot of people knew that that's where my career. I'm glad you asked me that. My career started at Hartford Area's Rally Together. It was interesting because when I got to UCAN, I was supposed to first work for Upper Albany, but Lorenzo thought that it would be better if I worked at Hart because I would get some of the training that I needed and, you know, be able to understand like how 501c3s work a little bit better in a place that would seemed a little more, you know, the infrastructure seemed a little more put together. Ironically, when I got there was a transition. We had an intern director and, you know, we were actually in trouble. And I didn't know at that time how to deal with that type of trouble. Now I know, but at that time, Hyacinth Yenny kept Hart above float, and I just kind of leached on to her and took her direction and her guidance and kind of did exactly what she said, and it worked out for us. Marilyn Rossetti came on. We were able to find a lead organizer, Tara Parrish now, who's still there, and we began to put together a very sound board, and we picked right up, and Hart started to do really great work. And so I appreciate my time at Hartford Area's Rally Together. I think that had I not started my career there, that I would not be able to organize in the capacity that I'm doing now. So I'm forever grateful for that.
Right. So because Hart primarily, is Hart a localized organization as far as who they serve in Hartford? Is there primarily a South End kind of organization? Do they just deal with that community?
Well, I don't know. I can't speak about their agenda most recently. I'm not clear on what their model and how the structure of their organizing department is set up now. But when I was there, we had 5 neighborhoods, and we had organizers for each one of the neighborhoods. And so it was Frog Hollow, Berry Square, South Hartford, Northeast, and Behind the Rocks. And I was the Berry Square organizer. We worked in all the organizers worked in all of the 5 neighborhoods, but I was assigned to Berry Square as the Berry Square community organizer.
So your travels have then taken you over to Blue Hills Civic Association.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting journey. When I was at Hart, we were working on problem properties. And at the time, I had met a family over at Schultes, and there was a young girl who a little Spanish girl, baby. She had to be about 2 or 3, and she was burnt up really bad from the hot water. And I became really alarmed and very angry about the idea of a young child being burnt severely by hot water. And so I began to talk to all of the people over there and realized that they had some slumlord issues. And so we decided to do this housing campaign, and from that we were very successful. HEART has done a tremendous job around the area of organizing problem properties and putting in ordinances. And I was there when that work started, and when I ride past some of the streets, I'm proud to say I was a part of that. But what happened is one night we had gotten some residents all set up, and I got in my car and I went to North Hartford, and I began to drive up Albany Avenue, and there's this gorgeous house on the corner of Oakland Terrace and Albany Avenue. And I started to see the dilapidation on each side, and my pride about what we had just accomplished on the other side of town went away quickly. And I had realized at this time I had been organizing, I think, for about 6 years at HEART. And I realized that, oh my God, there's no reason to be prideful about your work, because it's not all through the city. It's not citywide. And how do we make it citywide? And so that next morning I went and I told Marilyn, is there a way we could work with North Hartford to figure this thing out? I mean, you know, we've got some roads, we figured out how to do the proper research, maybe we can assist them in some of this. And we got a few calls, and it didn't work out right away, and I seen that it probably wouldn't work out. And so I decided that when they were changing the way organizing was being done in the city of Hartford, that if an opportunity presented itself, that I would like to work in North Hartford. And Blue Hills had a position, and so I took it.
Okay. So that you've been there for the last 4 years.
Yeah, it's been a road.
Okay. And is the work as an organizer in the Blue Hills community the same as your experience at HEART? Like, what are the differences that you see, like South End versus the North End?
Well, are we talking from an organizational perspective, or are we talking about a community setting?
A community setting.
Oh, from a community setting, there's not much difference. I'm always really amazed when we talk about community in the setting of a community from north to south, because I am probably, outside of Lorenzo, the only organizer who has worked in mostly the whole city of Hartford. And I stand to be corrected, but I'm talking about specifically from the nonprofit field and who has a title of community organizing. But no, they have the same struggles that we have. They have blighted buildings, they have public safety issues. Their schools are, I'm in some of their schools too with PTO council. And the difference, I would say, is that South Hartford leadership, and this is Marge NRZ specifically I'm talking about, know how to get together and hold people accountable. And that's not to say that North Hartford does not know how to do that, but they have it's a different level of leadership, I guess I want to say. And so it tends, and they come together a little more on the South Hartford and that group to attack any issue that they may have. And so in that respect, they're different. But when we look at the city as like in problems and issues that plague our city, there's no difference.
Well, now that we're a little bit more into who is Janice Fleming, one of the questions I want to know, how in your work in the community, how do you think people see you in the community? How do people, in your opinion, how do people see Janice Fleming? Like,
well, people don't see Janice Fleming in my community, they see Juan.
Okay.
That has been my childhood nickname, and it's no one in the community calls me Janice. Everyone calls me Juan. And they see me as this girl they came up with, who had a tough life just like us, who did things to survive just like us. I didn't just start organizing and have this, like, you know, I didn't traditionally go to a 4-year institution, and, you know, I did some things to survive, and I allowed myself to stay connected to them as I progressed in my organizing and my higher education. I did not forget my roots, and I did not forget my friends, and I did not forget the people who actually looked up to me making these changes in my life. And so when people in the community see me, they'd be like, well, wow, we seen you on Channel 5, yeah, what's going on with that? So for me, it's perfect because it allowed me to do my job effectively and begin to have dialogue with people who would never be involved in any community problem solving.
Right.
So,
okay, well, I think we've laid a great foundation, but there's still a lot more to Janice Fleming. You are a recent graduate.
Yes.
Trinity College.
Yes.
And you were a women's studies?
Women, gender, sexuality, and legal studies major, with a concentration on public policy.
Okay. So, out of your experience at Trinity College, you produced a television program.
Yes.
Called Voices of
Women of Color.
Okay, so we're actually going to get to the heart of the matter here, and kind of why we're talking and we're having this conversation.
Okay.
Because the Voices of Women of Color has turned out to be quite an effective television program.
That's what I hear.
But it grew out of your studies at Trinity.
Yes.
Was this a class project? Is this a part of your research at Trinity?
It definitely one of the things. I'm glad you are raising the questions about the Voices of Women of Color and how this project began, because we are getting a lot of comments and critical comments as well in regards to the project, which that's exactly what I was hoping for this project. And so when I began doing some research around the welfare rights reform during the second wave of feminism in the United States, I had ran across some of this wonderful, tangible minutes and notes from women of color in the late 18th century and early 19th century, of getting together and just talking and, you know, just trying to figure out how do we work together to begin to move ourselves out of the private sphere into the public sphere, because at this time women were still very domesticated. And so I was fascinated, because I felt like, oh my God, this isn't what we're doing. We're not bringing women of color together to have just everyday conversation and as a means to raising consciousness about issues that we may agree or disagree on. And so I did a lot of research. I did research for about 2 or 3 years and worked with a few of the professor heads, Professor Joan Hedrick, Professor Mark Cano, and Melissa Stuckey, and began to put this research together and wrote a paper on it called what was it titled? The Wins and Failures of Second Wave Feminism, something like that. And you know, and so I was really looking at how women of color found the space to deal with, like, groups like Now, Betty Friedan, and Mary Daly. And so I was trying to find our voice. So I was excited when I found these minutes, and then I got this fantastic idea, as I always do, and you know, and I said, why don't I put part of my work, why don't I put together a videography of women doing exactly today what women were doing back then as an addendum to my work. And so I invited a few friends over. You happened to be one, and we took on a question that was raised in one of my classes that was asked of me directly by a classmate. And in this particular class, it was Women of Color in Politics or something like that, and we looked at West Indian women, Indian women, black women, and all across the board of women of color, Asian women. And we would have these heated conversations, the white women and the black women in the class. And I would find myself being very defensive. And so I began to really dig deep into my research and try to figure out where we were, what was our voice, what fight we had, where were we in history. And through that, I decided to put together the film and ask everyone the question that was asked of me. And that question was, if you had a choice to work with upscale black people versus lower scale white people, which one would you choose? And I thought it was a brilliant question. I really, and it was a white woman who asked me this question. I thought it was a brilliant question. And so after class that day, I was riding home and I said, I'm gonna invite over a very diverse group of women of color. And when I say diverse, I mean in education, I mean in community involvement, I mean in religion. You know, we are very different. I wanted it to be diverse. I don't, you know, you can't have a conversation with someone who agrees with you. That's boring. It's boring. And if this work is about educating and bringing more people into the process, how do you don't invite someone who may not have the same intellectual background or the same higher education that you have? You want to expose them to a different conversation. And sometimes with that, you have people who say things that may not be so politically correct, or they may have not researched it. But through these conversations, they'll find their voice, and people will challenge them, and then they will force them to do the research. So this project set out of my studies, out of my research, out of what I'm disciplined to do, and that is to understand how race, gender, and class are intertwined, and then how does that affect policy. But before we can talk about policy, we have to have basic conversations. We have to begin to talk about some of the stereotypes that are out there, some that we have. Not just other people in this abstract, but things that we have. And because your voice is about your experience. This is the experience that you've had. And so this documentary isn't, I had some people say to me, well, Janice, you know, part of the problem is there's no one sharing the meeting. And I said, what meeting? These are women of color sitting around with a glass of wine. There's no script.
It's a conversation.
It's a conversation. And trying to find a space in which women of color can have quite frank conversations and not feel that they have to be restricted or sit a certain way or have a certain tone. I didn't want that. I didn't want to make women who may not have the vocabulary as other women in the room, may not have the education, may not have the political swabbiness as other women in the room, to feel uncomfortable. So this project allows people to be themselves. We're not living in a fantasy in this project, it's a reality. And so we've had, and what was really interesting about the first project, you were there, Naisha, we had several colored women say that they would much rather work with white women, as opposed to black women. So this work is very important. What's wrong with that? There's something wrong with that, Naisha. When we have a room full of colored women and you pose a question like that,
and that's your,
and they choose,
that's the response that you're hearing.
Yes, instead of saying, well, Tani, I think, was the one who said, well, I would try to figure out, at this point, I want to figure out how to work with my own. And I would ask her, not where she went wrong, but where the road turned. I thought that was so beautiful. Because why couldn't we have said, should we work with our own and them? It won't be either or. Right? It's about figuring out a way to work with people you even disagree with.
And not saying what you think is the right thing to say.
Yeah, all the time. We have, in this city especially, if you say something that may not seem nice, right? Either it's perceived as personal or you are attacked.
Right.
You know, and if you're attached to organizations and you take risks, then you may risk not being funded.
That's correct.
Right. And so, but I realize that, and as an organizer, it's critical that we deal with the issue of race, class, and gender, because they're intertwined in order to move forward. And so if we're, you know, I take the risk of having these tough conversations. I take the risk of putting together this project to begin to have women of color think about what they're saying, think about, you know, these differences that we have culturally, and, you know, and how do we recognize those differences and continue to embrace those differences while getting the work done. And so, you know, it's really interesting for me because, you know, my family is diverse. You know, my nieces are Spanish, and you know, my significant other is West Indian. So we have our own little UN. And so it's critical not just for my work, but for my personal life, that I figure out a way that we can work together across these differences. And I choose to do it in the way that we can begin to truly talk. Like, we don't have to feel that there's someone controlling the conversation. So although I'm happy that people see this as my project, it's not a closed project. As you know, you've participated. Any woman of color can participate, whether she's an elected official, whether she's a citizen, whatever the case may be. We just don't allow men, and at this time we're not conversating with white women. That will happen. But those conversations can't happen yet until we begin to conversate about what's going on with us. And when I say us, I'm thinking African American and women in this group choose not to be called African American. They choose to be black, which became problematic on one of our last DVDs. But this group of women who participated choose to be called black, and we have Latino women who participate, and West Indian women. And so those are the women, because this is an Asian women. We had an Asian woman. Oftentimes when we think of this city and we think of people of color, they're in our communities, they're serving our communities, and for some reason we have not, and when I say we, that's including me, haven't done a really good job of reaching out to the Asian community. And so I wanted to be better about that. And so until I believe through my work, through my research, I found that until they begin to dialogue, they cannot truly begin to work in the system, or for that matter against the system, whichever one they choose, as one voice.
Now, you had mentioned when we first started talking about Voices of Women of Color, this conversation being about experiences, and I bring that up to say, this last episode that you taped of Voices of Women of Color, which has now an issue has been raised about what the women were talking about, and specifically there was talk of, it was made mention that there was West Indian bashing, and that came about because of where this conversation had led to, and it was, the conversation brought about the experiences. The women in the room started to talk about their experiences as it relates to living here in the city of Hartford. So, and you wanted that, I'm assuming.
Oh, yes.
That's the conversation that you wanted.
Well, this is what the research had shown. Right? And we have to remember, when we get a room full of women of color in one room, those conversations may start with politics, but could end somewhere else. That's the beauty of us getting together and talking, is that, you know, this conversation may lead to somewhere else. These things are all intertwined.
So when you decided to tape this last episode of Voices of Women of Color, was the purpose of it to talk about the differences of West Indians versus black?
No.
Asian, Puerto Rican?
No, actually we started the conversation, I don't know, I've watched it now a couple of times, as you may probably know, but no, I began the conversation talking about women of color in politics. And I think one of the women asked, well, and I thought it was a really good question that Marquita raised, that, well, if in fact we're talking about women of color and we're talking about black women, how would Veronica see herself? Is the identifier first Jamaican?
Right.
Because, remember, when we say black, we're speaking of African American, but I want to respect these wishes and refer to it as black, right? Because there is a difference between African American, that's a certain kind of identity that, either one chooses or had been put on them. But I thought it was a good question. I thought that it was a question that so oftentimes we ask behind closed doors, right? And part of this project is allowing people not to hide behind closed doors so we can begin having these conversations. And so when she asked that conversation, we began to think about it, right? Like, well, would she? And it went other places. And people spoke about their experiences with different people from West Indian background. I've spoke about some of my experiences as well. And so it was never, these projects are never, like I said, we've done 3 of them. One was strictly dealing with African American women. We had one on how to recreate stronger alliances between women of Latino women and black women. And then this last one was women in politics, but turned into something totally different. And so, and you'll see it play out like that way in all of the tapes, because that's, for women of color, all of these things are intertwined. They're not in these separate spaces. When we talk about race and we talk about class and we talk about gender, they're not in separate spaces. They're intertwined, and that's what makes it so complicated. And that's what makes it hard for people to want to have real conversation about it, because when you're talking about it, it's not always pleasant, Naisha. And it's very hard work, but someone has to do it. I don't, sometimes when I'm in these conversations, I'm cringing because I want to shake one of the women that's sitting with me. But if this project is truly about us finding one voice, then we have to work through those stereotypes. We have to work through those differences, and we have to raise consciousness. And so I think that within itself is the beauty of the project, is that we all don't agree, and so they don't get to see the off-camera fighting.
So that's your ultimate goal? So you're not running for office or anything?
I don't. I'm glad, Naisha, that you've called me in and asking me this question. I have no intentions of running for office. Actually, it's been very difficult for me lately, because when I was at heart, I was just an organizer. I don't even think people knew that I did this type of work. I don't even think they knew I exist. And I find myself, while I'm working for predominantly my own people, these are when the questions are raised in regards to who is Janice. Is she running for office? I'm just trying to be an effective organizer, Naisha. I'm not running for office. I'm preparing to go back to school. But I recognize a gap in leadership, a huge gap, specifically for women of color. And so I have made it my business to, for the last 2 years, do the research, put together the logic model on how I feel we could approach closing the achievement gap. And for so many years, organizers have been told that, organizing and politics are separate things. This is what they teach you too in public policy, which is so hilarious to me. Clearly, policy oftentimes is set because of the political deals that are made in the back room. And so that was one of the reasons why I didn't want to major in public policy, but understood that my concentration had to be there because of that disagreement that I have, that this idea that policy is separate from politics, this idea that community organizing is separate from politics, when in fact the people who have founded organizing in this city now are elected officials. So to say that organizing and politics or public policy and politics are separate, to me, in my opinion, is false. And so what I look to do is to figure out, how do I begin to bring women into the process of community and politics, so that way we don't have a whole bunch of advocates blooming out of the community and no women of color thinking about politics and being a political figure, being a broader voice for the community at large. And so we have women, and you're seeing this, we have women who, you know, this community have never seen before, taking on these new roles, trying to figure out where is their place in the community? Is it advocacy? Is it politics? And so my job is to just use any skills that I have to kind of give to them, to allow them to have the tools to do whatever it is they may choose in the name of community work and charitable giving.
I do want to ask a couple of other questions about women in politics and your experiences, and maybe even some of your mentors, some of the women that you've looked up to. But before I do that, I have to get further deeper into those voices of women of color this last episode, because as you said in the beginning of when we opened the show, you're not usually in front of the camera. Yeah. And so we really, the question I have is, what has brought you here in front of this camera? And I'm going to be very specific about the events that have led up to this, and specifically Veronica Airy Wilson, Councilwoman Veronica Airy Wilson, felt as though the last episode of Voices of Women of Color was doing a little West Indian bashing, as she called it. And she called a meeting to have a conversation with some other West Indians about this. As a leader in the city of Hartford, how do you feel about Veronica's response to Voices of Women of Color?
Well, that's a really good question, Naisha, because, you know, the initial reaction that I had towards Councilwoman Airy Wilson's response to the Voicing of Women of Color was, obviously she didn't see the whole tape. That was my first initial response, because if it's watched in its full context, then you could not use the word as the West Indian bashing. But then I thought about it differently, right? Because I don't do personal well, Naisha. I usually lose fights when I get too personal. And if it's about the work, then Councilwoman Airy Wilson was correct in her actions. She's West Indian, and if she perceives that the Voices of Women of Color had been West Indian bashing, then she has every right to call a meeting to critically think about what it is that we said. So in that respect, we applaud her actions, because this is what we want. We want this project to begin to have other groups of colored people thinking and talking about, like, who are we? And how do people perceive us? And how do we begin, through these perceptions, create a strong alliances across cultural lines? So how do you create alliances if you can't reason with a person and talk about what's the problem? So in that respect, I think Councilwoman Airy Wilson hit it on target. If it struck a nerve, and it made you react, right? Because what I deem as a positive reaction is a negative and a negative reaction may not be what you deem positive or negative. And so she has every right to feel insulted or bothered by some of the comments. I stand by the project. We will not be changing the format. But I showed up to that meeting because I believe in accountability. That's one of the principles of organizing. And we showed up with the Voices of Women of Color, some that could come. And I was asked by Councilwoman Airy Wilson to leave, that the video would not be discussed, but in actuality it was. And I think that at some point, in order to truly be productive, if you are going to raise such an issue, and especially when you attach things like West Indian badging to them, then it's appropriate to call that person or that group to task in their face.
Yes.
And so I got up and went there, but Councilwoman Erie Wilson told me that I would have to leave, and it bothered me because it's really, it's a city-funded building, and to have an elected official tell me as a citizen that I have to leave somewhere didn't sit with me well. But if it's about the work, I think that it was appropriate that this group met alone first. And then I would hope that at some point that they called us back to begin to have an open dialogues as a way to working closely, and so that we can show people that it's possible to work together and have one voice. And this project is really about women of color.
Right. So
I really want to make that clear, Naisha. Like, this is about women coming together. And what I find interesting is that, this week I've had more women complaining about how other women aren't being respectful on the tape. And this is what this project is trying to buck up against, is this idea of how women have to behave in these spaces. And now they're being told how to behave even in their own space. Right? And so I think it was wonderful what Councilwoman Erie Wilson did. In fact, Dr. Marcano stayed in the meeting, and there's a few other people in the meeting who I actually work with from the West Indian community who I spoke to, and they said that it was wonderful that they actually was critiquing some of the areas they felt we fell short. They also wrote down some of the things that they had problems with that came out of the tape, and they had this, from what I understand, this wonderful dialogue that led into their own experiences. And so when we talk about this work, that's what I expect from it. And so I want to make very clear that we see it as a positive. And we thank Councilwoman Erie Wilson, and we hope that she follows up and decide to have a follow-up meeting in which she will bring the two groups together and let them kind of work that out in the room together. So I'm hoping, she has always, been able to contact me, and so I hope that she will do so.
Okay, so the doors open to the voices of women in color. Your work is going to continue?
Absolutely. Okay. Our next episode, we will continue on the conversation of women in politics. One of the things I didn't want is, after leadership in North Hartford, women that I work closely with worked so hard on registering people to vote, I didn't want that to just be because Barack was running. We need to figure out our own front door, our own local politics. And so these conversations about getting women to think, like some of the, Maria Sanchez's and the Trudys and the Ellas and the Carries, that this work has to continue even when we're not running. And so we will continue that conversation, and we invited Olga Vasquez to come in and make sure that all of the women understand what the voter registration card look like. And so we will be looking to have our next episode when I come back from vacation at the end of July. And so they'll have another episode in August. And we're going to do women of color in religion. I think that's very critical. What role do we play in religion, and how does that translate into the greater good, into the communities? And have we been active? And are we knocking on doors? Are we doing our charitable giving? Are we passing out food? Are we passing out clothes? Is it the church job to get involved in urban development? These are questions that, we could pretend that no one asks, but they do.
Right.
And so I no longer wish to ask these questions in safe spaces. I've already taken enough hits. I think I can take a few more. This project isn't funded by the city. This project, Councilwoman Erie Wilson made a mistake in the regards of how it's being promoted. It's never been on public access. It's never been on any of the public outlets. You can only get this showing on Access TV. That was intentional because there is a greater project at the end of this, and so we wanted to keep it kind of on the low, I guess, for lack of better words. But Councilwoman Ari Wilson, thank you, because we've gotten over 800 hits, and so there are over 800 people actually critically thinking about this. I really wish that it would have been shown. I wish you would have encouraged people to not just focus on that one, but to see the other two as well, because they would have been able to see that they're being critical on all areas. That there was not this one group targeted or like hand selected to begin to have conversations about. That's not what this work is about. I will never allow that. But how do you restrict someone's thoughts and you don't even know what they're going to say? Right. And if this project is called The Voices of Women of Color, how do you take away their voice by editing what you feel may be inappropriate?
That's right.
And so these are the things that I struggled with when putting together this project, and I decided that, you know what, if the women are willing to take a risk and speak these words, then I should not be the one to take away their voices if we're trying to find one voice. And so, you know, there'll be several times that people will disagree. There'll be several times that we say things that are not factual because of the different level of education and perspectives of one and experiences. You know, we've heard Marquita McCallia get very passionate and angry, and I raised this because it was a lot of the criticism came from this particular interaction, this comment. But these are personal experience. She had an experience with an elected official who she deemed as her friend, who she worked hard for, who she thought she would be working with to this day. And that woman, in turn, hired someone else. And so when we talk about people experiences, emotions are involved.
Right.
And so when you're in front of the camera, it shows. You can't hide it.
That's right.
And so, you know, that's her experience. And so to that respect, she's allowed to be a part of this project. She will continue to be a part of this project. Marquita has a master's degree in public policy and political science as her undergrad. And so, you know, this is a woman who, you know, I respect, and I will continue to allow her to participate if she wants to, and as well as Veronica and anyone else. There's no, this isn't a clique. I've heard it called a group. This isn't a group. This is women of color getting together, having wine and conversation. So these women, you'll see different faces all the time. I know a whole bunch of people.
Well, we'll get a little bit more into that with your final thoughts. We're going to just stop for a quick break real quick, and then when we come back, we're just going to wrap this up with some final thoughts on that.
Thanks, Naisha.
Entrena con rigor y mantente concentrado.
Respect yourself. Win the right way.
Todo es posible si así lo crees.
Don't cheat. It's not worth it.
Si no compites honestamente,
You cheat your family,
tus amigos,
your sport.
tú mismo.
Compite honestamente.
Because real athletes play fair.
Okay, we're back having a conversation, and I think we've answered the question about who is Janice Fleming sufficiently enough. We only have a short period of time left, but before we go, we're going to wrap this up, but there's some that says that maybe you shouldn't be the one to have this conversation. So in continuing on that theme of, we know who Janice Fleming is, but should Janice Fleming be having this conversation?
Why wouldn't she be? And she's a woman of color.
Okay.
You know, I say to those people, join me in the conversation, because if we look at the city of Hartford, one may ask themselves, where are the women of color? Where's the agenda? Who gets to set the agenda? Who implements the agenda? Whose voice is it? And so, you know, should it be me? Maybe not. But who else? who has taken on the role of trying to figure out, in quite frank conversation, none of this politically correct stuff, and none of this idea of who's chairing the meeting, who's controlling the voice, who's controlling the women, but who's bringing all different types of women together to have these frank conversations, and more importantly, taking the risk of allowing others to critique those conversations. Who else do we not think is important work, Naisha?
It's very important work. It's very important work. So with that, how can women reach out to you? Or how can other people respond to the Voices of Women of Color, and even this question of who is Janice Fleming?
Oh, well, I don't know if they want to know any more about me than they know now. But this project is open to everyone. We allow, as you know, we ask people to host the show in their homes, and so like I've had one, and so forth and so forth. So if anyone want to participate, they can contact me at Janice Fleming at www.janiceflemingyahoo.com, and my cell phone number 860-597-8881.
Why don't you put your cell phone
Oh
number
yeah,
out there?
you know, Naisha, a lot of times you know we have people. My job is to reach as many as people as I can, and I think that within itself makes people nervous sometimes. And I've reached a lot of people, and so and I continue to do that. And so my cell phone number, I mean, that's probably more people I can have one-on-ones with. So I'm always trying to find the opportunity to organize. It's okay, they can call me.
Okay, so Janice Fleming at yahoo.com, and then your cell phone number again?
860-597-8881.
Okay. Well, thank you, Janice Fleming. I feel as though I know you a little bit better and understand the purpose behind the work that you do.
Well, I thank you, and you know, I'm glad that you have agreed to participate, and I hope you continue to participate. And thank you for having me.
Okay.
All right.